So as far as emerging trends in research, there's four areas that I want to talk about. So digital society and online behavior, climate change and environmental sustainability, migration and integration, and AI and ethics. So these are four like big, huge social issues that we're all facing right now in terms of how we digitalize our society and even the digital divide, where there's some people who have access to high-speed internet and people who don't. And often when we hear about the digital divide, I think about like Western nations versus non-Western nations, or the global North versus the global South. But it's interesting to hear Mo talk about even in the United States, there are people who are still on dial-up and people who aren't. So the digital divide and digitalization is something that's happening even here in the U.S., which is something that I don't think we always think about. Climate change, of course, and environmental issues, migration and integration. So immigration is a really big policy issue right now at the governmental level, and there's a lot of talk societally going on about who's allowed to immigrate, both into the United States, of course, but globally migration. And then AI, of course, is a huge topic in every domain, from government to healthcare to transportation to education. In every domain of life, AI is coming up. So we want to look at these issues from a sociological, psychology, anthropology, economics, and political science perspective. So first of all, so the digital society, sociology, like I just said, talks about the digital divide, and it focuses on inequality and access. It also looks at online community formation. So sociologists are going to look at how like social media works, how people form communities, how people form groups. And also sociologists would do something called virtual ethnography, which is also called netnography. So if you remember, we probably talked about this, but it's definitely in the course materials. One of the research methods is ethnography, in which a sociologist or an anthropologist oftentimes will go to a community of people and observe them and take notes. And the research method is observation. So ethnography is observing a community of people online. So it's the same method as ethnography, but it's done online. So, for example, one of a recent sociology study that looks at digital society is research on context collapse in social media. And so, what this means is that when you see social media now, when you look at postings, like everyone that's posted on your feed, there's no more context to what people are saying. People just say like, "Oh, get rid of Musk." Like you just see that, get rid of Musk, and there's no context. And then someone else will say, "Yeah, get rid of him," and so there's no context about why and how and what the thought process is behind this. And so then we're fed this information about, oh, everyone says get rid of Musk, but I don't even know why we want to get rid of him. Why is he a problem? What is he doing? And so that's what that study is about. Is that context collapse in social media? So psychology is going to look at some of the questions that they're going to look at is social media, mental health outcomes, topics such as digital addiction, and online identity formation. So Jean Twenge did research about smartphone use and increased depression in teenagers. And what she found is that the more teens use phones, the more likely they will have major depressive episodes. So that's an example of psychology research looking at digital life and how digital life influences our mental health. From an anthropology perspective, they're going to look at digital cultural practices. Like, for example, an anthropologist might study the use of emojis or the use of language like, I don't even know, what do we call abbreviations like LOL and those kinds of abbreviations. An anthropologist might study things like that. Emerging virtual rituals, another thing in language, emojis, whether or not you wave on a Zoom call, how you greet people on Zoom calls. An anthropologist would study things like that. And technoethnography, also in ethnography, they would do the same thing. So an example of an anthropologist studying the digital society is Coleman's ethnography of hacker communities. So what she looked at was people who actually hack into systems, and rather than studying this group as a deviant subculture like a sociologist would, she studied it as a form of digital activism. and how people are actually able to create change by being hackers. I want to point out the difference between how anthropology approached this question than how sociologists would. So sociologists would probably look at hacker communities as a deviant subculture and look at it through the theories of deviance and say, how do they become deviant and why are they deviant and how are they doing this deviant behavior and that kind of thing. Whereas an anthropologist takes a view of saying, what is the outcome of this community? Well, the outcome is an activist kind of outcome. And so they create social change. So those are two different ways of studying the same question. So in fact, all of these social scientists could study hacker communities, for example, but they're going to approach a question from a different viewpoint. From an economics perspective, they might look at platform economics and digital markets, gig economy dynamics. So for example, if you've ever heard of like Upwork, people who do freelancing on Upwork, but also sharing and gig economy could include things like Instacart and Uber and Lyft. So all of that gig economy and economics person would look at. Cryptocurrencies, of course, that's something that economists would look at. So an example in the economics realm is work by MIT on the social impact on blockchain technologies. So I don't really understand blockchain enough to explain it to you here. I hope you know more about it than I do. But what MIT did is explored how this economic phenomenon of blockchain is actually impacting society beyond just the economic realm. And so they wanted to look at that. And then from political science perspective, they look at digital governance. So who's running these companies? And we were talking about that earlier in the class before we started the recording, as far as who's actually running the show here, who's receiving money from these platforms, who's receiving money from the digitalization, who's in charge. So they would look at that. Online political participation. So they might look at the political dialogue and political discourse online and in social media. And information warfare. So how, for example, different governments use like spying or other sorts of digital technologies to hack into or otherwise breach or broach other countries. So an example of this is social media's role in political movements. And so the Tefeki actually looked at how social media was used for political movements and political protest movements. So the next issue that we want to look at is climate change and environmental issues. So sociology, again, we're going to look at social movements related to climate change and environmental movements. Environmental inequality. So environmental inequality is the concept that some people, whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere in the world, have different access to different kinds of environmental quality. So for example, you've heard about in Detroit, where there was lead poisoning in the water that negatively impacted Black and brown communities in Detroit area that were predominantly poor. And so that's an example of an environmental inequality that we would look at. Also, another example would be people living next to power plants or people living next to areas that, like for example, richer neighborhoods tend to have more green space, more access to parks, more access to nature. So that's an example. And then societal resilience. So how is society actually reacting to climate change? How is society reacting to environmental degradation? What are we doing as a society to be resilient against these changes? Or are we being resilient against these changes in our environment? So an example is Dunlap's research on climate change denial, which is really interesting research if you're interested in the concept of denial and the concept of how people can look at, what most of us would agree are facts on the ground and say, no, it's not true, it's not happening. And so Riley Dunlap did research on people who deny climate change and how they're able to justify their denials. That was really interesting research. Psychologists might look at climate anxiety and ecological grief. So they might look at people who are really anxious about climate change, people who feel a lot of stress and a lot of distress about climate change. Psychological barriers to climate action. So why aren't people making changes to their personal habits to change the environment? Or how can we make behavior changes to help people, to encourage people to make changes to their habits that will improve the environment? So those are things that psychologists might look at. So Stockness looked at psychological barriers to climate action. So what he looked at was why people refuse to recycle, why people refuse to turn their water off when they're not using it, or turn off their lights when they're not using them. And so he looked at the psychological barriers of that. And again, this is an example where a sociologist or an anthropologist or even an economist could look at the same question: why people don't turn off their lights or don't recycle. A sociologist may ask that same question: why don't people recycle? But they're going to look at it from societal perspective and say, well, they don't recycle because their friends don't recycle, their parents don't recycle. Whereas the psychologist, and Stockton's example, looked at the psychological barriers to why people don't recycle. What is the interior or internal dimensions of why they wouldn't recycle or take other climate actions? From an anthropological perspective, we might look at cultural variations in environmental values, so looking at different cultures and how their values are different, indigenous knowledge systems, and climate rituals. So Hastrup did research on the indigenous Greenlandic communities' adaptation to changing environments. Now, this is an interesting example because, again, when I look at sociology, one of the examples I gave was societal resilience frameworks. So how does a society react to climate change or to environmental impacts? Here we have an anthropology example that's also looking at adaptation to changing environments, but again, it's looking at it from more of a cultural perspective, which is what anthropologists focus on, whereas a sociologist would look at how we adapt to changing environments from a societal perspective instead of a cultural perspective. Does that make sense? Economics, moving on to economics, they might ask questions like environmental economics, carbon pricing mechanisms. So how does our economic system encourage or discourage environmental protection actions? Like, do we have economic rules in place that actually discourage people from taking climate action, positive climate action? Or do we have economic rules in place that encourage sustainable actions? For example, like refunding bottle refunds to encourage recycling bottles and cans. So Nordhaus did research on climate change economics, and he created a model, which we've talked about before in this class, about how economics likes to rely a lot on models. So he created a really elaborate model to show how economic systems actually influence climate change. And lastly, the last example from political science, they're going to look again at climate governance frameworks. So what are the laws in place that are protecting or not protecting the environment? Environmental justice movements. So again, something that sociology might look at, something that anthropology might look at, is the social movements that have risen up around the climate change, and international negotiations. So looking at things like the Paris Accord, looking at international treaties about climate change. Ostrom did work on climate governance across multiple scales. So what she looked at was how these different levels of government, whether it's like metropolitan or local city government, all the way up to international government agencies, how these different levels of government work together or work against each other to protect the environment. The third issue that I'm going to talk about is migration and immigration. So sociology is going to look at transnational social networks. Like, for example, I worked on a project recently that looked at people from Sudan who would migrate temporarily to Saudi Arabia for domestic labor work. So they would migrate from Sudan into Saudi Arabia, do domestic labor for 2 or 3 years, get some money for them families, and then migrate back to their home in Sudan. So that's an example of work that a sociologist might do. They might look at second generation outcomes. So we all know what happens to people when they first immigrate to a new country, but what happens to that second generation or even the third generation? What do second and third generation immigrants, what do their experiences look like? And again, this isn't just focused on the United States. They may be looking at immigrants from Finland to the Sudan. Like, what does that look like? And social cohesion. So how do communities come together once you have an influx of immigrants or migrants in a community? How do communities rebuild and refocus and recongeal when they have a migration situation? So, for example, Alejandro Portes looked at assimilation theory for different immigration groups. So, what he wanted to look at is how do immigrants assimilate into their new community? How do they blend in? How do they fit into their new community? Now, psychology might look at acculturation stress. So, again, a very personal perspective of a social phenomenon. So, acculturation stress is how do you feel when you move to a new place, when you migrate, and you are trying to assimilate, you're going to have acculturation stress. Identity negotiation. So, how do you develop a new identity in a new country? Now you're an immigrant. Now you are maybe learning a new language, you're learning new cultural practices. How does that impact your identity? And then prejudice reduction and intergroup contact. So how are we able to reduce prejudice? And again, this is something that sociologists might look at, the anthropologists might look at, the political scientists might look at. But again, they're going to look at it from a very personal, individual perspective. So the example here is Barry's looking at acculturation, identifying integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. So what he looked at was how do people actually get acculturated to a new country? What are the factors that people need to go through? What are the processes and the stages that people need to go through when they move to a new country? Looking at anthropology, they might look at cultural adaptation strategies, transnational identity. So, for example, what does it mean to be Indian American? What does it mean to be Saudi Finn? Whatever your transnational identity is. And ethnographic approaches to migrant experiences. So, they're going to actually do ethnographies on migrants and on immigrants to find out what is it like to be a migrant or an immigrant in this particular location. So De Leon did a project called the Undocumented Migration Project, which looked at the material culture of border crossings. And what that means is the actual physical objects at border crossings. Like, what do people bring across the border with them? Do they bring their clothing? Do they bring their children's toys? Do they bring their photo albums? Do they bring their phones? What are the material objects that are coming across the border? And this is important because it shows what people value from their old lives as they bring into their new lives. Do they bring their wedding album with them? Or do they just bring their clothing and their wallet? Like how are they well, by looking at our material objects, we can see what we value, what's important to us in our old lives, what we think is going to be important to us in our new lives in our new country. So that was the work that De Leon did at border crossings. Economics, going to look at labor market impacts. So, for example, how migration impacts the labor market. If you have an influx of migrants into a new community, does that mean that there's more jobs created, or does that mean that there's fewer jobs for the locals, that the migrants are taking up jobs that the locals used to have, or does it mean that the migrants are taking up jobs that locals didn't want to have? So, for example, in the case that I gave you of the Sudanese moving temporarily to Saudi Arabia for household labor, those were jobs that Saudis didn't want. And so the Sudanese, who mostly women, the Sudanese women who were migrating temporarily to Saudi Arabia were taking jobs that the Saudis didn't want. So an economist would look at that. So, for example, Card looked at the Mariel boat lift, which showed limited wage effect on native workers, which is basically the idea that having an influx of migrants into a community has limited to no impact on the wages of the natives in that community. So, giving the example again of the Sudanese women in Saudi Arabia, it didn't impact the wages or the job economics of people already living in Saudi Arabia because those Saudis didn't want those household labor jobs anyway. So it didn't impact their wages. And then from a political science perspective, again, they're going to look at governance. They're going to look at laws, citizenship regime. So, for example, right now there's talk about revoking birthright citizenship here in the United States. So a political scientist would look at that. They would look at the concept of birthright citizenship, and they would look at the new policies about revoking birthright citizenship and what that would mean for communities. Border politics. Again, they might look, from a U.S. perspective, they might look at the border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Refugee policy. And the example here is Karen's work for open borders based on liberal democratic principles. So what Joseph Karen did was he argued for an open border policy and said we shouldn't have this idea of citizenship between, Mexico and America and Canada and all these different countries shouldn't have these citizenships. We should all be one big global world. And so that's the work that's coming out of political science. The last issue, and one that's closest to my heart, is artificial intelligence, because that's what I study. And sociologists are going to look at AI's impact on social stratification. So, for example, how do some people have access to AI and others don't, and how does that impact their livelihoods? How does it impact their ability to get work done or their ability to get jobs? Algorithmic discrimination is the concept that algorithms are actually giving us our news, for example, on social media. Based on what you are viewing, it's going to tell you what you are going to view next week. And so there's some technological determinism there. So, for example, Benjamin did work on discriminatory design in technology, and he termed it the new Jim Code. And the idea there is that there are some technologies that are discriminatory by their very design. So an example of that in medical technology, and this was an accident, but in medical technology, the CO2, the oxygen sensor that they put on your finger to tell whether or not you have enough oxygen in your blood, that oxygen sensor, prior to its revision, when it was first invented, only worked on people with light colored skin. And it gave totally inaccurate readings for people with darker colored skin. And they didn't know this for a long time. And what happened is that because people with darker skin, they would go in, they would get the pulse ox, and it would say, oh, your pulse oxygen is fine, when really it was really low. And so people were dying in hospitals because the pulse ox was not calibrated properly for people with all skin colors. Psychology is going to look at human trust. So again, looking at the individual level, human trust in algorithms, cognitive biases in AI design, and psychological impacts of automation. So they might look at, for example, the psychological impact of your job being now mostly AI driven, and going from a job where you used to do all the work yourself and now you're operating an AI system, or maybe you're out of a job because of AI. So they would look at the psychological impacts of that. So Shoshana Zuboff did work, she called it surveillance capitalism. And what she looked at is how these new AI systems and these new technological systems are actually taking the place of governmental surveillance on people. And so it actually limits our autonomy because we're constantly being monitored. All of our digital footprint is available to anyone, everywhere, at any time. And what we do online is basically what we do in our lives, right? So what we do on our phones, what we do on our computers, the fact that Google Maps is tracking our location at every moment. As long as you have your phone with you, people know where you are at any moment. As long as you get online once a day, we know what you're thinking about. We know what you're Googling. So those are the kinds of questions that Zuboff asked. Anthropology is looking at human-machine relationships. A fascinating example of this is people who fall in love with AI, or people who use AI as their therapists. And so there was a tragic story that came out not very long ago, a couple months ago, where a teenage boy fell in love with his AI chatbot, and he killed himself over her because he wanted to be with her. And so he committed suicide. So an anthropologist might look at situations like that. They would look at AI and cultural meaning. What is the cultural meaning that we ascribe to AI? Do we consider AI human? When I talk to AI, I certainly use words like you. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? So I talk to my AI just like I would talk to a friend. And again, they would look at ethnographies. So Suchman did research on human-machine interactions and how humans talk to machines and how machines talk back to humans, and kind of that interactional dynamic between humans and AI. And from a economics perspective, let's see here, looking at labor automation and economic displacement. So again, talking a little bit about what sociology would do as well, looking at the impact of how AI is replacing human workers. Algorithmic markets, AI-driven inequality. Again, you'll see a lot of those questions in sociology and anthropology as well. But again, the approach is different. So for example, what Algameglu and Restrepo did is looked at automation's differential effects on labor markets. And what that means is how it impacts some labor markets differently than others. So, for example, automation has impacted the auto industry a lot more than it's impacted academia, for example. And so what is it? What are the disparate impacts, and how are certain types of people being more impacted by automation than others? And then political science, lastly, again, governments, frameworks, digital rights. Who has the right to AI created content, for example? Who is the author of AI created content? Who gets cited when you use AI, for example, in a research paper? And power dynamics and technological regulation. And so here you have Eubank's research on algorithmic decision making in public services and its impacts on marginalized groups. And what's really interesting about her work is it could very well have been a sociologist doing her work. The difference is that she really looked at it from a global perspective and from a policy perspective, whereas a sociologist would look at it more from the marginalized group's perspective. She was looking at more from the policy perspective. So that is kind of an overview of some 4 big issues right now that the world is facing that social science is looking at. But obviously, social science looks at all sorts of emerging issues, including issues in healthcare, issues in education, issues in policy. And so the social sciences are looking at all of these big issues, but these are 4 of the kind of the biggest topics in social science right now. I just want to close with some new approaches that are coming out methodologically in social science. So we just covered some topical areas that are emerging in social science, but methodologically, the social sciences are also moving forward. So you have computational social science, which is basically the use of using big, huge data sets to do your science. So rather than using smaller data sets of, say, 1,000 or 2,000 or even 3,000 survey responses, computational social science looks at millions of data points. Mixed methods approaches, where you combine qualitative and quantitative data. Participatory research is really interesting, which is where you have a social scientist, often a sociologist or an anthropologist, but political scientists do this as well, where you engage the community that you're studying and they actually engage in the science with the researcher. So, for example, this is very common in environmental research, where a sociologist or an anthropologist may work collaboratively with, for example, Greenpeace, and say, hey, Greenpeace members, we don't want to only study you. We want you to participate in the research and help us design the research and inform the research questions and inform what we're studying, because you're the experts in this area, not us. Digital ethnography, I talked about that in ethnography. And agent-based modeling is something that's really going to happen in economics, which is where you are kind of modeling or simulating these social phenomena and emergent behaviors using modeling techniques, which again is something that you're going to see a lot in economics. So just to conclude, so social sciences really are evolving to address the new issues that are coming forth in our modern era. Social sciences are always changing. 200 years ago, social sciences was studying the emergence of new religions. We still study new religions, but now we're also studying the emergence of new technologies or the emergence of global climate crisis or whatever. And then interdisciplinarity, you start to see a lot more where sociologists are collaborating with economists or anthropologists are collaborating with political scientists to do interdisciplinary work. And then again, the methodological innovations that I just talked about. Ethical considerations, we talked about ethics already in this guided course. Ethical considerations become even more important when you start looking at these sensitive new topics. And of course, policy relevance and public engagement are becoming increasingly emphasized, which you can see from, for example, the participatory research methods that I just talked about.